By the time you realize you're revenge trading, you've usually already done most of the damage. That's the actual problem with almost every video on this topic. They describe revenge trading after the fact, once the account is already down 40%, once it's obvious in hindsight. Nobody tells you what it looks like from the inside in the first 90 seconds, while it's still small enough to stop. Today, I'm going to walk you through that exact window, minute by minute, because the entire skill of not destroying your account isn't willpower. It's recognizing 4 specific signs early enough that you still have a choice. Here's what almost nobody says about revenge trading, and it's the reason so many smart, self-aware traders still fall into it repeatedly. It never feels like revenge while it's happening. Nobody sits down and thinks, I am now going to make an irrational, emotionally driven trade to punish the market for what it did to me. If it felt like that, everyone would stop immediately. It feels, instead, like opportunity. It feels like conviction. It feels like finally seeing clearly after a frustrating loss clouded your judgment for a few minutes. The entire danger of revenge trading is that it borrows the exact same internal sensations as genuine confidence, which means the only way to catch it is to know the specific mechanical differences between the two, because your feelings alone will not tell you which one you're experiencing. Let's walk through an actual episode, second by second, because the abstract version of this conversation never sticks, and the specific version does. Theo had just watched a trade he was confident in get stopped out for a loss of about $400, a completely ordinary loss inside his normal risk parameters, nothing catastrophic, nothing that should have triggered anything at all. This is where I want you to pay close attention, because the first sign of an incoming revenge trade almost never shows up in the size of the triggering loss. It shows up in what happens in your body in the first 10 to 15 seconds after that loss registers. For Theo, it was a specific tightening in his chest and a sudden sharp urge to immediately look for the next setup, right now, before he'd even finished processing what had just happened. That urgency, the need to act immediately rather than to simply observe what just happened, is sign 1, and it's the earliest, most reliable warning available, because it shows up before any actual trading decision has been made. Most people miss this sign entirely because they're looking for something dramatic, anger, an obvious spike in emotion. What actually precedes revenge trading is often quieter than that. It's a kind of urgent restlessness, a feeling that sitting still after a loss is somehow unbearable, that something needs to happen immediately to resolve the discomfort. Theo described it to me as feeling like an itch that had to be scratched within the next few minutes or it would become unbearable. That specific quality, the compressed timeline, the sense that waiting even 5 minutes feels intolerable, is the signature of a nervous system trying to resolve discomfort through action rather than a mind calmly evaluating a new opportunity. Genuine opportunities do not come with a felt deadline measured in minutes. Only emotional urgency does. It's worth contrasting this against what an actual, legitimate opportunity feels like, because the difference matters more than it sounds like it should. A real setup that happens to appear shortly after a loss is not inherently suspicious. Markets don't pause out of courtesy just because you took a loss 5 minutes ago. And genuinely good trades do sometimes show up in inconvenient timing. The distinguishing feature isn't whether a new setup appears quickly. It's whether you would still recognize it as compelling if you'd seen it completely fresh, with no preceding loss, no compressed timeline, no felt need to act immediately. Theo, looking back at his own charts from that day with a clear head, could see plainly that the setup he took would not have made his list on an ordinary afternoon. The problem was never that a new opportunity appeared quickly. It was that the version of him evaluating it had already been altered by what happened 90 seconds earlier. About 90 seconds after his stop-loss hit, Theo found a new setup. And here's sign 2, which is subtler and more dangerous than the first, because it disguises itself as analysis. The setup he found matched his criteria, barely. It hit maybe 3 of his usual 5 confirmations. On a good day, he might have passed on something this marginal, without a second thought. But in that specific 90-second window, his brain reframed the marginal setup as a strong one, generating confident-sounding reasons on the spot for why this time, the missing confirmations didn't matter as much. This is what I call retroactive justification, and it's the second sign. Your criteria for what counts as a good trade quietly loosen in the minutes immediately following a loss, without you noticing the loosening happen. You don't consciously decide to lower your standards just quietly shift underneath you, and the trade that emerges from that shift feels every bit as legitimate as any trade you'd normally take, because the part of your brain doing the evaluating has already been compromised by the urgency from sign 1. There's a specific reason retroactive justification is so hard to catch from the inside, and it has to do with how confirmation itself works under pressure. When you're calm, you tend to look at a setup and honestly ask whether it meets your criteria. Under the influence of sign 1's urgency, the question quietly flips, usually without your noticing the flip happen. Instead of asking whether the setup meets your criteria, you start looking for reasons the criteria you already have don't fully apply to this specific situation. Normally, I'd want all 5 confirmations, but the volume today is unusual, so 3 should be enough this time. That sentence sounds like judgment. It's actually the retroactive justification mechanism working exactly as it's designed to, manufacturing a plausible-sounding exception precisely when an exception is needed to justify a trade the urgency has already decided you're going to take. Theo took the trade. Sized normally, he told himself, though when he checked later, he'd actually sized it about 40% larger than his average position, a detail he hadn't consciously registered while placing the order. This is sign 3, and it's the one that turns an isolated marginal trade into genuine account damage, a subtle, usually unacknowledged increase in size, justified in the moment by some version of the sentence. This one's a really good opportunity, so it makes sense to take a bit more. Notice that this is the exact same sentence a legitimately strong, well-confirmed setup would also produce. The sentence itself cannot tell you which situation you're in. What can tell you is the timing, a size increase that shows up in the immediate aftermath of a loss rather than as part of a pre-planned criteria-based sizing rule is revenge trading's fingerprint, almost without exception. The trade went against him almost immediately, and this is where sign 4 appeared, the one that actually determines whether the episode stays contained to one bad trade or spirals into something that genuinely threatens the account. Theo's instinct, watching the second position also move into a loss, was to immediately look for a third trade to get back what the first 2 had cost him. This is the compounding instinct. And it's the most dangerous sign of the 4 because it's self-reinforcing. Each subsequent loss increases the urgency from sign 1, which loosens the criteria from sign 2, which increases the size from sign 3, which produces a bigger loss, which restarts the entire cycle at a higher intensity than the one before it. Theo caught himself here about 4 minutes into the episode, and this is genuinely the only reason his account survived that day with a loss of about $1,100 instead of something far larger. He recognized the pull toward a third trade, named it out loud to himself, actually said the words, "This is revenge trading," and closed his platform for the rest of the session. I want to be specific about what actually interrupted the cycle for Theo because it wasn't willpower in the sense most people mean that word. It was a single mechanical habit he'd built months earlier, entirely disconnected from this specific day, a personal rule that any position taken within 15 minutes of a stop-loss triggering required him to physically close his laptop and wait a full 10 minutes before reopening it. No exceptions, no judgment calls. This rule existed before he needed it, built during a calm afternoon with no money on the line, specifically so that the version of him experiencing sign 1 wouldn't be the version making the decision about whether to trade again. The rule didn't require him to correctly diagnose in real time whether he was thinking clearly. It simply removed the option to act within the exact window where his judgment was least trustworthy. Now let's talk about Wendy, because her story shows what it looks like when someone builds enough structure that the 4 signs never get the chance to compound at all. Wendy had a stop-loss trigger on a Tuesday afternoon, similarly ordinary, similarly within her normal risk parameters. She told me she still felt the exact same physical sensation Theo described. The tightening, the urgency, the itch to act immediately. The signs themselves didn't skip her. She's not somehow immune to the underlying mechanism, and she was very clear with me that anyone who tells you they've eliminated the urge entirely is either lying or hasn't been trading long enough to hit a bad enough day yet. What was different wasn't the absence of the feeling. It was that she had a rule in place. A mandatory 20-minute break after any loss above a certain size, enforced by literally closing the trading application, not just resisting the urge to click. That removed her ability to act on sign 1 before signs 2 through 4 had any chance to develop. The urge showed up right on schedule. It simply had nowhere to go because the platform wasn't open. And by the time 20 minutes had passed, the specific urgent quality of the feeling had faded enough that the marginal setup she might otherwise have found suddenly looked exactly as marginal as it actually was. This is the single most important distinction in this entire video, so I want to state it plainly. The goal is not to eliminate the urge to revenge trade. Nobody eliminates that urge completely, no matter how many years they've been doing this. The goal is to build a structure that doesn't require you to resist the urge in real time, because in real time, during the exact window these 4 signs are active, you are operating with meaningfully impaired judgment, in a way that's genuinely comparable to being tired or mildly intoxicated. Nobody would trust a person driving on 4 hours of sleep to reliably judge whether they're too tired to drive. The same logic applies here. The version of you inside an active revenge cycle is the worst possible judge of whether you're inside a revenge cycle, which is exactly why the decision has to be made in advance, by a calmer version of you, and then enforced mechanically rather than relitigated emotionally. Let's talk specifically about how to build a personal early warning system for the 4 signs, because recognizing them in someone else's story is very different from catching them in yourself in real time. For sign 1, the urgency spike, the practical marker is timing rather than feeling. If you notice yourself wanting to place a new trade within the same few minutes as a loss registering, treat the timing itself as the warning, regardless of how legitimate the new opportunity feels. Some traders build a literal timer into their routine. Any loss above a defined size starts a mandatory countdown before a new position can be opened, with the platform closed for that entire window. The point of the timer isn't superstition. It's that the specific urgency driving revenge trading has a fairly short half-life, typically fading substantially within 10 to 20 minutes. So simply outlasting the urgency, rather than fighting it directly, resolves most of the problem on its own. For sign 2, the loosening criteria, the practical marker is a pre-written checklist you're required to fill out in writing before entering any trade, not just consult mentally. Writing forces explicit acknowledgement of which specific confirmations are present and which are missing. And it's much harder to unconsciously round 3 out of 5 confirmations up to good enough when you have to write the number 3 down in front of you. Wendy keeps this checklist on paper, physically separate from her trading screen, specifically so that filling it out requires a small, deliberate pause, rather than something that happens instantly inside her head where the rounding up can occur unnoticed. For sign 3, the size increase, the practical marker is a hard rule that position size is determined entirely by a formula set in advance: account size, defined risk percentage, and a stop distance, with 0 discretionary adjustment allowed based on conviction. This sounds restrictive, and it is, deliberately. The entire function of the rule is to make it structurally impossible for a moment of borrowed confidence to translate into a bigger bet. Because the size was never actually a live decision to begin with. It was determined by arithmetic, hours or days earlier, by a version of you with no active loss to react to. For sign 4, the compounding instinct, the practical marker is a hard daily cap on the number of trades you'll take after a loss of a certain size, decided in advance and enforced by literally logging out of the platform once the cap is hit. Theo's rule, after his $1,100 day, became a maximum of 1 additional trade following any loss above his defined threshold. Win or lose, full stop, platform closed after that. The cap isn't about believing the 3rd or 4th trade will definitely be bad. It's about recognizing that the 2nd trade already comes from a compromised decision-making state, and every subsequent trade compounds that compromise rather than correcting it. It's worth adding one practical note about how to build these 4 rules, if you don't have them yet. Because the temptation is to design something elaborate, and elaborate rules tend to fail at exactly the moment they're needed most. The best version of each rule is boring, binary, and requires no interpretation in the moment. Not take a break if you feel like you need one, which still requires a compromised mind to judge its own compromise. But close the platform for 20 minutes after any loss above this specific number, which requires no judgment at all, only compliance. The 4 rules described here took Theo and Wendy months to calibrate to their own trading style, their own typical loss sizes, their own emotional patterns. The specific numbers matter far less than the mechanical, non-negotiable nature of the rule itself. I think it's worth naming something uncomfortable about why this specific mistake is so hard to prevent through willpower alone, because it explains why even highly disciplined, otherwise successful traders still occasionally fall into it. Revenge trading isn't really about the market at all. It's about an unresolved feeling, frustration, embarrassment, a sense of unfairness, searching for the fastest available route to resolution. And a new trade offers a uniquely compelling illusion of immediate resolution because it holds out the possibility of instantly reversing the exact feeling that triggered it. No other action available to you in that moment offers that same illusion. Going for a walk doesn't promise to undo the loss. A new trade does, at least in the story your brain tells itself in the moment, which is exactly why the pull toward it is so much stronger than the pull toward any of the genuinely useful things you could do instead. This is also why the 4 structural rules matter more than any amount of self-awareness. Self-awareness helps you recognize the pattern after the fact. In a video like this one, sitting calmly with no money on the line. It helps far less in the actual 90-second window, because the entire mechanism of revenge trading works specifically by narrowing your attention and compressing your sense of time, which are the same conditions under which self-awareness is least available to you. You cannot outthink a state that specifically degrades thinking. You can only pre-build a structure that acts on your behalf while that state is active. The same way a smoke detector doesn't require you to remember to check for smoke, it simply goes off regardless of what you're paying attention to at the time. There's one more distinction worth making before we close, because it separates a merely educational understanding of this topic from something you'll actually use the next time it matters. Knowing the 4 signs intellectually, the way you now do after watching this, is not the same as having a rule that fires automatically when they show up. Theo could have described these exact 4 signs to you in detail a full year before his $1,100 day. Because he'd read about revenge trading, understood the psychology, and genuinely believed he'd recognize it happening to him. He didn't. Not in the moment, because understanding a pattern in the abstract and detecting it in real time while your attention is narrowed and your clock is compressed are 2 entirely different skills, and only one of them is trained by watching a video. The other is trained by building a mechanical rule, testing it on a smaller scale, and trusting it enough to let it override your in-the-moment judgment even when that judgment feels completely convincing. Theo hasn't had a repeat of that specific $1,100 day in the 2 years since. Not because the urge stopped showing up, he told me it still shows up several times a month, right on schedule, following any meaningfully frustrating loss. What changed is that the urge now arrives and finds a closed laptop waiting for it. Because the 15-minute rule doesn't ask him, in the moment, whether he thinks he's being rational. It was decided before that question could even be asked, back when the answer was still easy to get right. So if you want to know whether you're at risk of revenge trading before it costs you anything real, don't wait to feel angry or reckless, because you probably won't feel either of those things. Watch instead for the itch to act again within minutes of a loss, the quiet loosening of your own criteria, the size that crept up without a clear decision behind it, and the pull toward a third trade to make up for the first 2. Those 4 signs, not your mood, are the actual early warning system. And the only real defense against any of them isn't stronger willpower in the moment. It's a rule built in advance, enforced mechanically, by a calmer version of you who already knew this exact moment was coming.